So we're going to go into our first panel discussion. The title of this one is Shifting Sands. And the purpose of this panel is to examine the legal implications of what happens when the science informs us about moving, literally, land and sea boundaries. So we're going to have a really nice comprehensive look at this issue. Our moderator today is my good friend and colleague, Rob Thompson, at our partner institution, University of Rhode Island, Department of Marine Affairs. Who here is a Marine Affairs alum? There you go.
Could you ask them to send donations?
I don't think RWU will let me solicit other institutions on your behalf, Rob, but... So URI is a great partner for us and a great contributor in terms of pumping out lots of great people into the marine affairs world. So Rob is going to be chairing this panel for me and moderating it. We're going to start off with the scientific perspective. And Dr. Isaac Ginis is a professor of oceanography at University of Rhode Island. He's a leading expert in numerical modeling and forecasting of air-sea interaction during hurricanes. Very timely information for us to be pondering at this point. And he's going to talk about the growing evidence of links between climate change, sea level rise, and extreme weather events. And if you take a look in his bio and the description of his presentation, this figure should jump out at you. Weather and climate contributed to more than $1/3 of $1 trillion in damage worldwide in 2011, and this year's total may rival that amount. Just something to think about. Next, we're going to hear from Tom Ruppert, a good friend and colleague of mine from the Sea Grant family. Tom comes to us from Florida, where he works as a statewide specialist in coastal planning. He's an attorney and focuses on legal aspects of adaptive planning for sea level rise, hazard mitigation, post-disaster recovery planning, and a lot of these other long-term challenges and opportunities for Florida's coastal communities. So after Dr. Ginis tells us about the events that impact the land-sea interface, Tom's going to start exploring the property issues related to these situations, including a case in Florida on erosion and how it impacted public infrastructure along the beach, and perhaps some options for property purchasers. Next, we're going to hear from Caroline Karp, a colleague from up the road at Brown University, the Center for Environmental Studies, where she teaches international and domestic environmental law and policy courses. She's going to be building off of Tom's presentation, exploring more issues related to property rights. When retreat is the better part of valor is the title of her presentation. She's going to be covering accelerated sea level rise, flood insurance maps, and I think is going to put out some suggestions for how a state like Rhode Island and its municipalities may want to think about hazard mitigation with private property owners. Finally, we're going to hear from a presenter. I'm so pleased to have him with us, Dr. Lou Gritzo, who's Vice President and Manager of Research at FM Global, which is one of the world's largest commercial property insurers. It's probably been a bit busy in your office these days, I would imagine, Lou. Just a couple of things going on with major commercial properties on the eastern seaboard. So he's going to talk to us about managing risk to success in a climate of change and uncertainty, and how his industry is looking at these risks and hazards that we're confronting. So let's start with Dr. Ginis, please.
Can you lower the light a little bit? Yes, good morning, everyone. I'm going to speak about the relationship between the climate change and extreme weather or high impact weather. You can imagine this is a very large topic, and I will only have 15 minutes to make a few comments about this. And obviously, it is impossible not to talk about high impact weather without mentioning Hurricane Sandy that affected more than 20 states. And the last list of fatalities exceeded 185, and the damage estimates about $52 billion. And this is been really surprising for many people to see such a huge damage and impact. And I can tell you that the truth is this is not a worst-case scenario. This was only Hurricane Category 1 storm intensity. As many of you know, the hurricanes can reach up to Category 5. And the damage typically relates to the wind speed is roughly as a cube. So there's a significant increase of damage as the wind speed increases. Now, if you want to see the details of the damage by Sandy, FEMA put together a very nice interactive website that you can actually point on different locations and see whether the highest impact was. And you can see, for example, in this image, the purple color indicates whether there's the most significant impact, mostly due to flooding. Now, the media named Sandy as a superstorm. And indeed, Sandy had a number of features that are not very typical for hurricanes. And I could mention a few that essentially very important to realize that it may be something that we might expect in the future more often. First of all, Sandy was moving relatively slow, and which is unusual for hurricanes in the late of the season. Just for comparisons, the 1938 storm that came to New England late in September of 21st was moving so fast, it came to make a landfall with a forward speed of about 60 miles per hour. And the signature of Sandy was found in New Hampshire. So that storm this storm, Sandy, was moving much slower. One of the reasons is that jet stream was much slower than usual. Usually jet streams are responsible for accelerating the movement of tropical cyclones. Another thing was unusual, that the temperature of the water was about 5 degrees warmer than average, and that allowed the storm to expand. The diameter of Sandy was about 1,000 miles, and that was one of the reasons it affected so many states. Another unusual factor was this blocking of the atmospheric system that was north of Sandy, not allowing Sandy to continue to move to the north, as typical storms do, but rather to make a very sharp turn to the west. Now, of course, with this significant event, it was impossible to ignore the discussions about global warming, and here's a few highlights from the media. And this is, of course, a very positive thing that media started to pay attention, some politicians, about the connections in climate change and extreme weather. However, the scientists are much more careful here. There are certainly some signatures in this storm that might be related to the trends connected to global warming, but there's a significant more studies that will be, I'm sure there will be a lot of studies of this storm, and we will learn much more in the future. But let me just make a few features that potentially can be related to the global warming. One of those is unusually warm temperature. Obviously, the temperature is one of the important ingredients for hurricanes. Hurricanes actually get energy from the ocean through water vapor supply, and the temperature plays a very important role. Another thing I mentioned is the weaker jet stream, and that may have to do with the differences in the temperature gradients. And with a global warming scenario, when the Arctic will get warmer, the temperature gradients may reduce from the tropics to Arctics. That may lead to weakening of the jet stream. So we might expect storms will be moving slower in the future. And then there's another large blocking Arctic weather system to the north of Sandy. Some studies indicate that the enhanced ice melting and Arctic warming may be conducive for building these atmospheric features more often in the future. What does science say about relationship of hurricanes and climate change? So the present thinking is that most likely that the number of tropical cyclones will not increase in the future. However, those storms that do develop into hurricanes will become stronger. This is the example of one modeling study that's been done recently that indicates that the number of Category 4 and Category 5 hurricanes may increase in the Atlantic by 81%. So we might have a less number of Category 1 and Category 2, but much higher number of more intense storms. Of course, the combination of the sea level rise and the tropical cyclones is that what we're mostly concerned about. And there's another recent studies that indicated that the sea level rise north of Cape Hatteras on average about 3-4 times higher than the global. And of course, that is a big concern with the landfalling storms that sea level rise combination with the storm surge would certainly accelerate and increase the impact in terms of flooding. And Dr. Corey showed you graphs of sea level rise globally. This is kind of a local perspective, just to make sure that we are not immune in Rhode Island from sea level rise. This is a tide gauge measurements in Newport, and you can see the steady increase of sea level rise. And also, one may say that recently, the sea level rise actually is accelerated. This is one of the things that we have less skill in predicting. In fact, all the predictions made previously in terms of sea level rise have been wrong. So we might be actually experiencing accelerated sea level rise in the future, that the science is not there yet to be confident on what level of sea level rise we might expect in 50 or 100 years. So let's now look from the global perspectives. There's been a special report by IPCC, International Panel of Climate Change, that just came out a few years ago, particularly focusing on extreme weather events. It's a very detailed view of the weather conditions and events all around the world. I really encourage you to take a look, because there is really a lot of information that you can get from this report. But the big concern in terms of the weather events in the future are in terms of their intensities, of the frequencies, and the impacts. I'm going to give you just a few examples of the most recent extreme weather events around the world. This is an example of February 2009, wildfires in Australia, the largest on the record. More than 175 people died. 2010, Pakistan experienced the largest flooding on the record, as well as China. Russia had the hottest recorded summer in Russian history. 56,000 people died during that event. February 2010, a huge snowstorm, which was called as Snowmageddon. And that might be counterintuitive, think about global warming and the winter storms. But in fact, if you understand the nature of the significant snowfall, is actually a combination of the moisture coming from the south, typically from the ocean, and the cold air coming from north, from Canada. When they collide, they produce a significant amount of rain, of snow. So what these diagrams show below is the anomalously warm temperature in the wintertime will be conducive to increase the evaporation and moisture supply, and that will lead to a significant increase of snowfall. Again, another example of a huge snowfall blizzard in 2011 that affected 30 states and more than 100 million people. Again, a similar phenomenon. A record drought in 2011 in Texas. And again, this might be again a signature of the events that we might experience more in the future. Hurricane Katrina, Hurricane Irene last year. Again, a huge storm, very large size, that again might be a feature that we'll be seeing more in the future. Because of the warm water, the hurricanes will get more energy to expand, not only intensify, but also expand. Irene affected 4 states, 11 states, made landfall in 4 states. And after Sandy, we had this unusual northeaster. Again, related to the very warm temperature in the Atlantic that provided significant amount of moisture that collided with the cold air and been one of the reasons for significant snowfall. Well, if you now look at the history of the weather disasters in the US, and NOAA has this very nice website, which has been regularly updated, that indicates the number of 1 billion or more weather events in this country. And I want you to take a look at these numbers. Obviously, you see that there is a trend of the increase of number of extreme weather events. So the total extreme events from 1980 were 136. From 1980 to 1995, we had 46 1 billion or more disasters. 15 years, 46. From 1996 to 2012, the number of disasters were 90. So from about 3 per year, now it's about 6 per year. And with a total estimated damage about $1 trillion. Of course, this is a big concern for the insurance industry. This is a report that was published recently by the biggest reinsurance company, Munich Re, focusing on the number of natural catastrophes from 1980 to 2011 globally. And the colors here indicate a different type of disasters. So red are associated with the earthquakes, which are pretty steady. But green is the meteorological events, like tropical storms, winter storms, severe weather, tornadoes. You can see the trend of the increasing the number of these events. The blue is the hydrological events, flooding, storm surge. Again, you see that in the increase. Climatological events, heat waves, cold waves, wildfires, droughts, also increases. So you can certainly see the trend is going up and up. So in summary, the latest IPCC report confirms that extreme weather events essentially worsening, and this is most likely due to climate change. And the scientists are virtually certain, 99%, that the world will have more periods of high-impact weather through the 21st century. Thank you.
And we will again hold all our questions till the end of all the presentations. Where are you? There you are. There's your device. That's the laser. Forward, back.
Well, thank you very much. Susan, I appreciate the invitation to be here and for the excellent organization that you and everyone else here has put together for this conference. I would like to discuss this morning the case of Jordan versus St. Johns County. It's an interesting case in Florida, but rather than go into the excruciating legal details, I just want to give you an idea of the case so that we can look a little bit at some implications from it. So to start off, this case originated because the state of Florida built Highway A1A originally in 1950 right along here. And you can see right down here it joins with this new road. Well, they built that original road out along the beach in 1950, immediately started having severe problems with erosion. By 1960, the state had basically given up and said, okay, we're going to reroute it, and they purchased this right-of-way here and built that in 1960. The state more or less kept the old A1A somewhat passable for a number of years until in 1979, they finally got the county of St. John's to accept that right-of-way from the state. That was mistake number one for the county in this instance, really. Mistake number two on the part of the county was, at the time that they accepted the right-of-way in 1979, in this entire 1.6 miles, there were only 3 homes. They started permitting homes, and by the time this litigation began, there were now 25 homes on the same stretch. And just to give you a little bit of an example of just how dynamic this has been, like I said, there's a 50-year history here of problems and erosion, but just to give you a little bit of idea of the dynamism of this, if you see that arrow up there, you can see, well, before I even do that, see this little trail here? That was called the pig trail. Some of the homeowners were actually using that as an easement by necessity over private property to access their properties. And now that can no longer even be used because if you look at that red arrow and then we go to the next one, that red arrow is in the same location. So you see there's a river there, and now what you see is sand. Basically the ocean breached that little spit that was separating that river from the sand, filled that river with sand. And here you can actually see the bank of what used to be the river. And this is actually a boat dock right here. And here, my favorite part is the sign prohibiting harvest of shellfish except by the lessee. Here you can see the road during a storm, and notice that the right-of-way is to the right of those power lines. And here on a recent walk on that beach, you know, some old road bed and a water line and cable. So what happened with this case? Well, essentially these homeowners that had built there and were permitted by the county to build along Old A1A, you know, of course the road is disappearing. The county was doing maintenance, trying to keep it open. They would sometimes try to grade it. But essentially very little of the road is even paved anymore. And these owners got together and they sued the county, and among the different claims that they made, the two that I want to discuss really are they claimed a taking of property because of the impeded access to their properties, and they also claim that the county has a duty to maintain that road. And at the trial court level, the county won on summary judgment, and the trial court said, look, this can't be a taking here, because in order for the local government to take your property, they have to do something. And the county in this case didn't do anything. The only one doing anything that's taking away your access, it's the ocean, it's the waves, it's the erosion. This is a natural phenomenon. It's not the fault of the county that you're having problems with access. Second, they said with regards to duty to maintain the road, they said, well, as a legislative body, the function of this local government is to make the kinds of discretionary decisions about how and where they invest their money in their roadway system, and that is at the discretion of the local government. So it essentially becomes what we'd call a separation of powers issue if the judiciary comes in and starts telling the local government where it has to spend its money. And in addition, you really have to ask, how do you put a road back right here? I mean, this is the active wet sand beach right there. The county's actually applied to the state to put armoring in there so they could try to protect the road. That was denied. Can't put armoring in. County spent a significant amount of money on an engineering and research study to try to determine, well, what else can we do there? And they came up with nourishment as an option. The initial estimated cost would be $13.1 million, and then the longer term estimated annual yearly maintenance cost would be somewhere in the vicinity of $1 to $2 million. So I guess what you start looking at is well, then when this case went up on appeal to the 5th District Court of Appeal in Florida, that court took a much different view of this. And they said that, yes, the county does have significant discretion in how it spends its money to deal with its roads, but at the same time, that discretion is not absolute. And you can see the language here that the court used. They said they must provide a reasonable level of maintenance, and that must result in meaningful access. Well, the court declined to define either of these. They simply remanded it back down to the trial court, and the trial court now is going to have the burden of trying to assess, did the county provide a reasonable level of maintenance that resulted in meaningful access? And that will help to determine if there was indeed a taking of private property or not. So you start looking at this case and you start asking yourself, well, if these people don't have access to their homes, is that fair to them? If the county's other taxpayers are going to end up spending $13 million plus $1 or $2 more million a year to give access to a handful of homes, is that fair to the taxpayers of the county? And so I think when you start, part of what can actually impact our view of that question, I think, relates to what these owners knew and understood at the time they purchased their property. Is it one thing if somebody comes from Iowa and say, buys this as a retirement home, say 30 years ago, and let's assume that at that time there were no issues with erosion or flooding there? You know, and then now they're faced with this. We might have one view of that person, whereas if the person who purchased this house bought it a couple weeks ago and they had lived in the area for the past 40 years and knew the history of how long this road has struggled and the county has struggled with this road, we might think of them a little bit differently. So that really brings me to this idea of notice or disclosure to potential coastal property purchasers. in a way, you might think this shouldn't be all that controversial. We like people to understand what they're getting into. And as a matter of fact, if you go into your economics, you really understand that the part of the theory of a free market economy is that consumers have information about the goods that they're purchasing. So this actually is, in a way, a form of notice right here. This high water marker from Katrina in 2005 is actually on an embankment of Interstate I-10 over in Bay St. Louis, Mississippi. And this is actually a bridge of I-10 right there. And the feds put this in post-Katrina as just a memorial to the event. And the officials in Bay St. Louis were not so happy about this. So you had there was a great video of the mayor of the town that I watched on the internet talking about how, this is some of the most prime land for development in this entire region along I-10, and you're messing it up because you've got this there. And so actually the local government ultimately was successful in convincing the feds to allow them to paint this over with, a welcome to Bay St. Louis sign. But it can also, this idea of what people know and when they know it can also have some potentially legal implications. I guess I was assuming that everybody would be attorneys, but I know everybody's not. In law, for a regulatory taking of property, one of the fundamental elements of the test for that is what the courts have called reasonable investment-backed expectations. What was reasonable for this person to expect with their property? And that really occurs on a case-by-case basis where the courts look in detail at the factual scenario. And so I've just put up here, there is a long list of different factors that courts around the country have taken into account when trying to assess this, but I've just listed a few up here that either have been used or can be used, and I put notice requirements up in red because really it hasn't been very clearly defined whether and how this impacts reasonable investment-backed expectations. A couple of different cases have actually kind of skirted around this issue. One of them I think we're going to hear more about, the severance case in Texas. Texas has the most comprehensive and detailed notice requirement to potential purchasers of coastal property in the country. It's amazing. And in one of the early severance cases where the state had prevailed early on, it was cited at length by the court, and part of what it did is it told these potential property purchasers, like Carol Severance in this case, that this beach is actually subject to an easement for the public's benefit to cross on that beach, and that if any private structures come to be located on that public easement, that those are interfering now with the public easement and must be removed. And indeed, that is what happened in the Severance case. And like I said, is anybody here going to actually address that case? By chance? Yes. A couple of you, I'm hoping. Good. Okay. And then in the Jordan case, it was also briefly mentioned. But in the Severance case, even though they cited at such length that notice requirement, the court never explicitly said how that did or did not affect its analysis of the reasonable investment-backed expectations of Carol Severance. I think to some degree, you could draw an implication that since the state actually prevailed in that court case where it was cited at such length, that maybe it did have some impact. So in just looking at this Jordan case back to Florida in St. Johns County, in my work with local governments, I try to use this as a case to get these local governments to understand that you need to be thinking longer term when you're making your decision processes. Because I think many of these local governments are kind of stuck in the idea that when we're looking at permitting, we have to really be thinking, well, we have to permit everything because otherwise somebody's going to come after us and claim a taking of their property for not permitting it. But yet there are a lot of other potential costs that might be even more onerous to these local governments than facing a takings claim for not allowing construction. And this Jordan case really points that out. So you've got significant potential liability for permitting development in risky situations. And if you either put in infrastructure or worse yet, like St. Johns County, accept infrastructure that's already suffering from problems, you might really be on the hook if the courts are now coming along and saying you have to spend in order to keep that going. So, I mean, you talk about fairness, and some people think, well, that doesn't sound very legal, but really, at some level, the Fifth Amendment really is still about fairness. The Supreme Court here indicated that that whole concept of fairness is part of what does underlie its Fifth Amendment takings jurisprudence. So I get some parting thoughts. we all understand that sea level rise is going to have some really huge costs involved with. There are going to be tremendous losses by property owners, and there are going to be tremendous costs for all levels of government to try to protect property owners. I don't think any of us really believe that politically it's possible that these different levels of government are going to simply abandon private property owners to their own devices throughout the country. But at the other end of the spectrum from that scenario, I think most of us also understand that federal, state, and local governments also simply do not have enough financial resources to be able to become the guarantor of happiness that every private property owner is just fine no matter what happens around them. That's simply not a fiscal possibility for us. So then that leaves us, well, how do we find a balancing point in between those two extremes on this continuum? And really, for me, one of the things that seems a possibility is trying to understand how this idea of reasonable investment-backed expectations can play a role and how notice can actually impact that. So understanding who has information, who can best take that information into account, who should have it when, and ultimately, if we are giving good information to people and they are making these choices, do we then, as the public, have a responsibility to be the insurers of the risk that they are choosing to undertake? Thank you very much.
So good morning. It's nice to see everybody here today, and I want to thank Susan for her work putting this together. And I see lots of colleagues here, some of whom I haven't seen for a long time. It's nice to see all of you. I have a couple of students here, and I'm glad to have them. It's great to have students in an audience like this since they're kind of inheriting this mess. I'm going to actually focus on southern New England here, and so I have some pictures of the destruction that Sandy caused in the very recent past. And I think you're going to recognize some of these places, and that's not so important, except to say that we have a population that's very much exposed to coastal risk here, and that's what this talk is going to be about. So I've worked on water all my life, and some of you will remember this childhood game where who wins, water, stones, scissors, and all of that. And I believe, and I think a lot of other people would believe, that water always wins. So if you go around this circle of elements, water douses fire, rusts scissors, erodes rock, and just completely disintegrates paper over time. And there are some things that survive in water, but really we're subject to water. And what that means is this talk really is about how do humans interact with a coastal environment, with water. How are we actually going to deal with this with these events? And we've been doing it for a long time. I think everybody here knows that living on the ocean is a highly desirable thing to do. These properties are gorgeous. It's a beautiful view. People like to do it, and it's going to be hard to get people to move unless they have to move. And I went the wrong way. I've been watching the Browning cottages for a number of years now, and so this is after Tropical Storm Irene last year. This is what they looked like last week. There used to be at least one more cottage here, and I believe that one washed away in the 1954 hurricane. So these are very vulnerable properties. I've also watched the Coast Guard house rebuild after several storms, so where boulders somehow came through the windows, and yet they think that is legitimate to keep rebuilding. I also want to point out these images of the beaches here, where basically we have properties built right on the ocean, but leaving a fair amount of debris in the sand, so related to septic systems, on-site sewage disposal systems. And that leaves a question for all the planners in the room: do we really want to be rebuilding on-site sewage disposal systems this close to water? So we have public health issues, we have environmental and ecological issues related to that. I walked along Matunuck Moonstone this weekend, and that beach is littered with PVC pipe from septic systems, and that beach by no means took the brunt of this storm. So we're basically destroying infrastructure along here that we probably ought to think about. So fortunately, other speakers have covered this, so I'm just going to stress that this area is experiencing, is experiencing sea level rise. This is a figure from John Boothroyd, but I believe the Sea Grant people in the room basically updated this a bit. So we've already experienced close to a foot of sea level rise in this region since 1930. Another 1 foot is projected through the end of the century, but that really is a lowball estimate. And I've seen estimates that say we're likely to see between 3.4 to 4, almost 5 additional feet under some of the extreme Arctic ice melt circumstances. So there's this sort of case here of being an interglacial period and some level of ordinary sea level rise, but then if we actually get this Arctic ice melt that was discussed earlier, we could be in serious trouble because storm surge occurs on top of that additional foot or up to additional 6 feet. So here's the problem for planners, and that's why I really am addressing this talk too. So the map on the left-hand side, these are Rhode Island Division of Planning maps out of Land Use 2025, show the distribution of population density in the state of Rhode Island essentially at present. And you can see we're very much a coastal state. So what we've done is we have high population density up here in the city of Providence, but what's happened since the 1970s is a lot of population has migrated down here to the barrier beaches, Newport, and the islands. The projection at the current trend of population distribution is we're going to increase this pattern. We're increasing population density up in these urban rivers. That's problematic given what happened in Tropical Storm Irene and even worse, the 2010 springtime flood before that. But we're intensifying development in these coastal areas. Well, if you take a look at the city of Providence, so I've shown you these pictures, dramatic pictures of houses eroding along the coast, and it's really easy to show people, here's sort of the sense of destruction, but in fact, our largest populations are also big urban populations, and we really need to address those. So if you're in Connecticut, we really need to address the New Haven, Bridgeport, Fairhaven, the city of Providence, city of Newport, city of Manhattan. We've got big coastal cities with major public infrastructure, and really a lot of the attention should go there perhaps instead of on the barrier beaches, except that the barrier beaches help protect us. So I actually, now that I live in Providence, I don't see very much attention being paid to this issue about how we're developing the waterfront and whether or not we're actually securing the waterfront for anticipated sea level rise and potential storm surge and storm damage on top of that. So these images here are sort of the eye candy version of this. These are all from Rhode Island showing overwash from Hurricane Sandy. And I looked at the USGS figure, and this looks like an impact 4 storm to me based on this overwash into the coastal ponds. But most importantly, what I want you to see is, and I think somebody said this facetiously, Tim Faulkner said this facetiously, is that given the importance of Rhode Island's beaches to the state economy, of course we're going to rebuild. It's a no-brainer, right? The economy is going to demand that we rebuild this, and I want to challenge that. So this whole talk is going to challenge that notion about whether or not we're actually considering the appropriate elements in deciding what is economically desirable for the state of Rhode Island or any other coastal state. Early assessments of damages related to Sandy were in the $20 billion mark. I heard $50 billion today, but in the New York Times a couple of days ago they said $20 billion, of which only $5 to $10 billion was insured. Now that's an issue because you then must ask, well, who picks up the difference there? It's actually quite expensive to pursue beach renourishment. These are data from a 1996 beach renourishment project in Narragansett at about $11 a cubic yard. And this is actually a small section of beach. This would be about 600 feet of beach by about 100 feet of beach by a couple of feet thick. And if you look at the whole coastline that needs beach replenishment, that is not desirable unless you unless you talk about who pays for that. So I love this quote, trend is not destiny. So I teach students, and I feel as though my job is to say, we need to be optimistic about this. There are these dismal trends about increasing atmospheric CO2. We have some control over that, so we first and foremost have a duty to mitigate. But what I would also say is that we can look at the increase in population in these coastal communities, and we can start making decisions about what we ought to be looking like 25, 50 years out into the future. How are we going to adapt to this, given that we've committed ourselves to a certain level of warming? And so this is what I will summarize. These are basically my conclusions, is that we already have adequate authority to address these risks. We already have it. We don't have to invent new legal authority to address these risks. And I would also say that we also, in the state of Rhode Island and elsewhere, have the ability, maybe not the political will, but we have the legal authority to start shaping what the future looks like in a way that protects public health, safety, and welfare, but that also protects our economic interests in the coastal zone, as well as functional ecosystems, so that we can continue to address food security from coastal waters, as well as ecosystem services, which very rarely get included in this conversation. So we really need to have a new way of accounting for our interaction with coastal systems. Now, there's a complicated diagram, but what I want to propose to you as a public policy matter is that the more, oh, I only have a minute, so this is very seriously problematic. All right, well, this is the most complicated slide. So if we think that we should take this very seriously, then we probably would try to seize property by eminent domain. So the government has the authority under the Fifth Amendment to take property as long as it pays just compensation. But that's really the last resort. It's really way too expensive to do this. So for example, Connecticut has 32,000 properties that are in this at-risk area of, at present, would be in a VE zone, exposed to storm surge at so less than 3 feet above sea level. And that's without considering effects of climate change or erosion-prone areas. Rhode Island, the state has produced maps showing how many properties are in this VE zone, but an additional 49 square miles will be in this storm surge zone if you count in erosion and the rest. So you don't want to buy up all those properties. Well, if you don't take this very seriously, then the thing that we could do is just educate people about solutions. And that's in fact what we're doing. We spend all our time educating each other as though this is where we stand on this curve. What I think is we actually belong somewhere in the center. We really do have some serious problems to address here, and we actually have tools to measure them, or to address those. So, for example, there's my laser here. We could be really taking this opportunity to say, don't rebuild. More than 50% loss, call it quits. Or look at these areas that are really in serious erosion hazard and flood hazard zones, and we start to say, it's time to retreat. It's time to step back. You can see the trends. If there's really not controversy about the data, it's time to basically put that burden back on the private property owner and say, you assume the risk. And you don't externalize the risk beyond the boundary of your fee simple absolute estate. So I think we probably belong there. I think the state, we already have a map showing unbuildable areas. We ought to be enforcing that. No build in unbuildable areas. I'm definitely getting a signature here, so I just want to reinforce what Thomas said, which is we need more information. So we could take advantage of this period to basically say, post this information, require property owners to record all this information in the land evidence records. So at least prospective buyers understand something about risk, the history of flooding on the property, history of wind damage on the property, whether or not the property is insured. And another issue that could be recorded in the land evidence records, or another thing that the state could easily do, would be to require multi-year insurance. So I will just quickly jump to my last slide here, and I have a lot, so I really believe trend is not destiny. And I think CRMC is actually doing a wonderful job with this in its various special area management plans of starting to get the state to talk about coastal greenways and essentially a living shoreline that gets everybody to step back from the shore. And I think CRMC deserves a lot of support for this, and especially up in urban areas, but along the entire coastline. Thank you.
While Susan gets the slides geared up, let me give you a disclaimer. Although I work for an insurance company, I'm a recovering engineer and applied mathematician. And so I'll just take a couple minutes doing what every speaking course tells you not to do, which is talk about yourself and your company first before you tell the audience what they really want to hear. But in this case, I think it's important that you know the perspective from which I'm coming. FM Global is a commercial industrial property insurance company. That's all we do. We don't do homeowners or personal lines. We're basically an engineering company that writes insurance. We've been around for 176 years following the same process that you can basically reduce your risk and then insure the risk that you can't reduce. Most importantly, we're mutually owned. So everything I talk about is going to be about FM Global and our clients. So I'm going to try and bring a business perspective to this discussion. Our job at FM Global in terms of supporting our clients is to do fundamental research on hazards and loss prevention. This is our research campus in Western Rhode Island, 1,600 acres out in the Foster-Gloucester area, where we do a variety of physical and natural hazards research. We also have a scientific office. This is more like your typical university science office in Norwood, Massachusetts, with small-scale forensics labs. Pretty much anything that breaks comes here. And then we do scientific computing as well. We're basically a company of about 5,000 people, 1,800 engineers, 39 offices around the world. The big difference is that we do 100,000 risk assessments of our clients' facilities every year. So a facility that we will insure, we will send an engineer, they will do a risk assessment, they will provide a numeric score and risk recommendations to that client in terms of how they can reduce their risk, and that's the basis for our underwriting. Okay. So we use our loss history like actuarial-based insurance companies, but we use physical engineering guidance. Okay, so what's happening now? Obviously, you've heard from the prior speakers that climate's changing. We know that. We're living in a world of economic instability. And as you heard from the prior speaker, we're living in a world where we're putting ourselves increasingly at risk. And businesses are no exception to this. Businesses are increasingly vulnerable by some of the decisions that they're making in terms of where they decide to locate and how they decide to set up their business model. So there's the hazards changing, there's economies changing, and the vulnerabilities changing. We had a great speaker on climate change. One of the things commercial industrial insurance company or commercial industrial companies like the Fortune 100 look at and they say, wow, we don't know a whole lot about how the climate's going to change in the future. And so this is certainly a challenge in terms of dealing with the uncertainty. What we do know is when it affects us hard in Rhode Island. More than that, it affects us worldwide because we have a global economy now. Supply chains are tightly linked. And we basically built up, through business models, throughout the Fortune 100, 500, 1,000, a brittle system of interdependencies where the world's economy depends on things that happen a long way away. Okay. Evidence in point, no single event could have affected global GDP more than Hurricane Sandy because it hit the area of the US coastline that had more of the supply chain related GDP of the US than any other place in the United States. California quake wouldn't have done it. Midwest tornadoes obviously won't do it. So 14 to 17% of GDP related issues are affected by Hurricane Sandy. We'll see how that plays out. If we look beyond our own coastline, we look at the occurrence of catastrophes in North America, which is where most of the current economic strength is based. We start to look at growth in emerging economies. We take that same kind of ratio of growth or vulnerability to those catastrophes and we forecast that out into emerging markets. We're going to see 3 times, whoops. Let me go back here. we're going to basically see 3 times more economic impact of natural catastrophes due to the effect on growth in Asia when we look out 20 years down the road. Okay, so the growth is all going there. They have natural catastrophes too, just as much or more. We look at the same kind of ratio of vulnerability. We're going to see tremendous economic impact into the future. And there's some additional supporting information I don't have time to go into. What we've already heard is that we know this is happening. Commercial industrial losses right now are over 110 billion a year from Swiss Re. Okay, so what's the solution, right? What's happening here? Well, certainly the issue is assessing the risk drivers. There's commercial CAT models or catastrophe models that are out in the industry that are used to make economic decisions. These are the tracks that those models use to predict hurricane frequency and the economic impact. They're very good overall in terms of kind of gross numbers, but not very good in specific. Okay, so these are very approximate tools that the financial industry and the insurance industry uses to estimate economic loss. What we do know is what some of the basic hazard levels are. If we take a look at hazard levels in New England, the 100 and 500-year storm surge levels, we have a pretty good idea of where they are, and Sandy sits right about slightly greater than the 100-year level for that region. Okay? So this is not a black swan. This should not be a surprise to anyone. This is something that's within the realm of possibility, and we have an idea what these hazard levels are. Okay, so what do? Well, we obviously have to reduce those key exposures. What this means for businesses is reducing the exposure of their property, reducing the impact on their business interruption, protecting their shareholder value, and protecting their reputation. This slide's important because the first 2 you can insure against. You can insure against property and business interruption. You can't insure against shareholder value or your reputation. Okay, so a lot of the onus will sit on commercial industrial property owners and companies to take action to prevent their own exposure. Well, I just toured the Hurricane Katrina affected region. There was a reference to what happens in that region right now. This is one solution. It comes with free RV parking underneath. It certainly is not, I think, it's a paradigm shift for homeowners. And what we know is that people's actions in their businesses translate to their homes and vice versa. So I think this is something that we need to consider. So, all right, great, it makes sense. We're going to assess the risk drivers. We're going to drive those exposures down, so why doesn't it happen? The first is what I'll call the uncertainty trap. We're not really sure it's going to happen. How do we know how climate change is going to affect us? So because we don't know enough, we're not going to do anything. All right, and that's not the solution. What we're advising our clients to do is protect to the 500-year event. We know that pretty well now. We'll keep an eye on things as things change. If those hazard levels change, that's what we'll adjust to. The other barrier is clearly cost. If you're going to reduce risk, that's going to cost. That comes out of your bottom line. You generally don't make profit out of that in the near term, although I can give you examples of where companies make profit in the long term because they're in business and capture market share that businesses that get put out of business don't have. But certainly in the near term, it's cost. This is an example from Hurricane Irene where just some simple flood barriers kept this hospital in business, kept it functioning. Just a little foresight. Worked very well. Our experience in Hurricane Katrina shows that relative to the standard kind of location, standard building codes, clients that followed our advice had 85% less loss and the improvements on average took less than $10,000 to perform. And it's about half and half of our clients were in these 2 buckets of the 480 locations that we had physically affected by Hurricane Katrina. We have about 500 that are affected by Sandy right now, so a nominal kind of analogy between these 2 storms. Simple kinds of things, just basically fastening down roofs, okay? Good flood protection. Don't cost a tremendous amount of money, but it requires some foresight. The biggest barrier, however, is really the mindset barrier. Okay, we can talk about hazards, we can talk about physical loss prevention. The mindset's a difficult one to deal with. We tasked a study of Fortune 1000 companies. 96% of those companies have operations somewhere that are exposed to natural disasters. Only 20% of executives from those companies are seriously concerned about the effects of their bottom line. And this is referenceable. You can see this on our website. This translates to employees as well. 75% of US-based workers feel their employer is not really well prepared for a natural disaster. Only 29% are confident they'll have a job the next day. So what do we do about it? Well, we know some things. We know that the mindset changes when the risk is described in real terms. Of course, the easiest way to have this described in real terms is to experience it, but we hope that that never happens. So certainly describing the risk in real terms is a benefit. Bringing disasters to life, experiences that people have gone through, help. In the scientific community, my personal perspective is we don't do ourselves any favor by talking about 100 and 500-year events. I'm not going to live to be 100 in my estimation, certainly not 500. We need to talk about 1% and 0.2% events. That 100-year event has a 1% chance of happening every year. And although there's some correlation between weather patterns from year to year, Mother Nature doesn't remember whether it happened 40 or 50 years ago. Okay? So we need to really refer to those events differently in the nomenclature that we use to change the mindset. So what I hope you take from this, I've got 3 key points. Deal with uncertainty by avoiding the trap, and work in your local areas, your businesses, your lives, and others to do that. Define cost-effective solutions. They're out there. We provide loss prevention guidance free on our website. Our loss prevention data sheets are available for anybody to pick up. We hope our competitors pick up those loss prevention data sheets and improve their businesses so that when our competitors go out of business, we can ensure those businesses and they'll be well improved. And the last one is break through the barriers of mindsets. That's the most difficult one. This is a culture change that's going to take some time, and hopefully we can do it painlessly as possible. I know we're going to take questions at the end, so let me just leave my 3 points with you for you to jot down in terms of getting through the uncertainty trap, working those cost-effective solutions that are out there. They require some creativity, and the biggest challenge of all of us is to really change the mindset. Thank you.
It's always a pleasure when a program comes together the way that you want to. So we've already heard a little bit about the severance case. We're going to hear a lot more about the severance case. We've now breached into the world of some legal issues about property rights and notice. So law students in the room, property is relevant. It's a relevant thing to know about. Just want to touch on a couple of things before we open it up for questions. If I can ever get out of Lou's presentation here, sorry. Must be going the wrong way. Just get out of here. We have folks from the Rhode Island CRMC here today. We're going to be hearing a lot more about Rhode Island's reaction to these impacts that we've been discussing, as well as the other Northeast states later today. And we're also going to hear about the Arctic later today. Has Jeff Feinberg arrived yet? So he's our mindset guy. He's gonna tell us tomorrow what is the solution to this mindset issue that Lou has articulated so well for us. So I'm gonna turn it over to Rob to moderate. Julia and I will be fielding the questions from online and from either side of the room.
Okay, is this mic on right now? I guess it is. Well, I think my job is very easy because I think there's going to be a lot to talk about here. Does anybody want to start with a question from this side? Oh, I thought Grover was. Actually, back here, could someone get the mic?
Thanks. My name is Jessica Granis. I'm from the Georgetown Climate Center. I had a question for Louis. Over what time scale are you assessing the vulnerability of your clients, and how are you dealing with the fact that the 1% and 0.2% storms are based on historical data and aren't considering, how these will change over time and how the impacts will extend further inland?
Is this on? Can you hear me? Yep. Okay. Yeah, it's great questions. The first part is that we can only assess vulnerability of our clients based on what we know today. So we use today's knowledge as a snapshot in time. Companies don't like moving targets. So when you go into a company and you say, this is what you need to do, and you come back the next year and you say, yeah, I'm glad you did that, but this is what you need to do now, it causes them grief. So we need to work into the changes that the climate is presenting us in a graded fashion. And so part of our protection mechanism is to protect that 500-year event. That's the way we manage the uncertainty around those hazards. keep our eyes on climate change, start to focus on the things we know are changing, which in this case is severe storms in the U.S., and start to implement a graded approach to our clients for them to improve their risk over the time frame associated with their capital improvements, which is typically on the 3 to 5 year time frame. Somebody plans a capital improvement, they take it, they put it together, they get a cost estimate, they take it to their board of directors, the board of directors approves it, they go ahead and do the contracting, and they get it accomplished. So that's the kind of horizons maybe that you were asking about.
Anybody would like to add to that at all? Okay, I have a webinar question here from Clark Alexander, and it's for Thomas Ruppert. Please answer the question that you asked at the end of your talk concerning taxpayers. You're not getting away with just asking questions. And the response concerning taxpayers' responsibility to pay for individual property owners' behavior if buyers are adequately informed about risk prior to the sale. Please address not only local liability, but federal liability as well. And I guess I commented, it was almost to me like Armstrong was being turned on its head.
Well, I don't want to answer my own question. I just want to ask it. It's a lot more fun to ask than to try to actually come up with the answers to this, because it is really complicated. And I don't know that I have a solution per se, but I think that it's part of the conversation that we really need to be having. Because if you look at some of these situations right now, I mean, at least in the Jordan instance, if the county was supposed to be held liable there, I would argue that the county should maybe be held more liable because of the stupid decisions it made in permitting those homes to be built there, as opposed to under our takings law for not guaranteeing that nothing bad happens to those people. Because that's really, in a sense, what they're asking for. They're asking for the taxpayers to basically protect them from Mother Nature. And whether or not they should really have that right, and whether or not we should really be footing that bill, I think is a good question. But what's really challenging about this, everybody says, well, here, Hurricane Sandy, no, this is a learning opportunity, right? This is one of those windows of opportunity for a learning moment, all these phrases. Well, that sounds well and good, but you can't really go out there and say to people in the midst of a disaster, you know what, you knew this could happen and you chose to take this risk. And no, actually what's going on is everybody's already starting to struggle with how can we get FEMA, the local governments are all asking how can we get FEMA to pay even more than 75% of our infrastructure repairs, and what are we going to do to provide relief for all these people that didn't even have the National Flood Insurance Program subsidies. So it's really unpopular at those very moments to really ask the hard questions. But these are questions that we need to address because the numbers are huge.
Just as a quick follow-up, do the owners really want the road maintained, or are they trying to force eminent domain?
You know, I've had some conversations with the attorney that I've worked with that is working on this case, and that we've had some chats. That's one question I actually haven't had a chance to ask him. At one point, they did ask the local government, I forget what year, to give them the road, to formally abandon the road so that they could take charge of it and have it as a private road.
So the county made two dumb choices.
Oh, they made plenty of dumb choices. But ultimately the county said no, they weren't going to do that. And I don't know the history of if they said no because then they would have been required. I mean, under Florida law, it's very clear. Most states, if you formally abandon a road and that eliminates access, that now the local government has to pay for that taking.
Can I follow up on this? So the question was raised in Thomas's talk about the issue of notice and how much notice a person has to have to basically assume the risk of building in a risky area. And for those lawyers in the room, you'll remember the Palazzolo takings case because it occurred in Rhode Island. And Justice O'Connor, who had 4 people join her in the dissent, basically said about the reasonable investment-backed expectation that the claimant's knowledge of the regulatory regime in place at the time that he acquired title and the nature and extent of permitted development may also shape the reasonableness of the claimant's investment. So knowledge matters. In fact, lawyers can look back and say it matters. And then she ends that quote by saying, for if existing regulations do nothing to inform the analysis, then some property owners may reap windfalls and an important indicium of fairness is lost. And so this is actually a message to local planners that you actually ought to go ahead with these challenges. I think the state and local government are likely to be judgment-proof, looking at some of the damage here where septic systems are destroyed and causing a public nuisance, for example. And you'll hear more about severance later, but I think notice is a huge issue, and I think governments tend to be judgment-proof on that basis.
Please.
Thanks. My name is Don Hooper. I'm a regional representative from the National Wildlife Federation, and I'm from Montpelier, Vermont. You've enumerated a lot of destructive activities caused by global warming, and I'm wondering what each of you would favor as one public policy option or something that we could adopt realistically that would either staunch the warming that we're creating or adjust to the warming that we've already put in motion.
So should we start with here?
Well, that is a little bit beyond the area of my expertise, but I think that would be a losing game proposition of thinking about only adaptation. I think that the acceleration of the effect of global warming will get us to the point that just adapting would be very difficult, if not possible. So we're talking about, as such, a dramatic impacts in certain places, including disappearance of islands. I think the adaptation is not going to be the solution. So we have to think about the mitigation efforts. And of course, one obvious mitigation effort is to reduce the production and emission of the carbon dioxide. And that's a difficult road that we all, not only the US, but the entire world should consider to undertake. And I think there's a positive signs that of increased awareness, particularly in the countries outside of the US, in Europe, in Asia. And I'm hoping that the efforts of the media and the politicians will make, and other organizations, is to make people more aware about the potential consequences of climate change, and that we will get sort of a public support that the actions that will have to be taken.
You know, I would mention, speaking of countries outside the United States, I'll mention my home state of California. California just started its greenhouse gas market today, and they're looking for partners in other states, and New England has often followed California's lead. So that might be legislation we see coming along.
Well, gee, I thought the part of this country that was outside of the United States was Miami. I'm certainly no expert on mitigation, but I agree that while I focus personally on adaptation in my work and professional life, clearly mitigation is important, but again, not my expertise, so I'm going to leave that aside. If I could do something, I think what I would magically do is probably require very detailed notice requirements for potential purchasers of both coastal property as well as property in other hazardous areas, and make sure that that is properly structured. I've done some research and I've published on just how that could be done most effectively within the property transactions to ensure the maximum efficacy so that people actually do learn something. It's not just another one of those sheets in a stack this thick that you're flipping through and signing on the day of closing. And then also try to encourage people to argue before courts that this is really, that notice is legally important in your analysis of what's going on in the future.
I think mitigation, we have to pursue mitigation. I don't think that's going to solve the problem, so I'm just going to say I suspect that we're going to end up with geoengineering, but I'm not going to address that, and I'd like to hear what the scientists think. But I suspect when we talk about doubling atmospheric CO2, we're going to, at some point, start looking at geoengineering. In terms of adaptation, I think we need to shift the risk back to the property owner so that we have risk-based insurance premiums. We need to have performance bonding so that the property owner is responsible for all externalities associated with that behavior. And I mean, you know, the driftwood all over the beach, I mean the PVC pipe all over the beach, the chimneys, the construction debris. That needs to be internalized so the property owners basically assume responsibility for that choice to live in hazardous zones. And I think we have all sorts of market-based tools to do that, and I would say use the market first of all before we go to command and control. So I think the insurance industry can play a role. The NFIP, the National Flood Insurance Program, has just been amended in some really positive ways so that people who have second homes on the beach are not going to benefit from subsidies. Some of that can happen at the local level as well. So Rhode Island could set up its own state insurance pool to cover uninsured properties. We probably ought to do that and help finance that with a surtax on some of these properties.
Clearly, public policy is one part of the solution. We believe insurance is another part of the solution, but I'll take this opportunity to dispel the myth that the insurance industry has this huge stick that we can wield to change behavior. No. You know, we can adjust premium, we can, you know, we can work with our clients to reduce their risk, but at the end of the day, the market drives those decisions, and businesses make those decisions independent of any kind of reduction in premium that we can provide to them. This has got to be something that when we see businesses succeed, they decide that it's in their own best interest to reduce their risk. Their board of directors directs them to reduce their risk. As part of their enterprise risk management, they consider that their risk has to be something integral to their company's operations and how they treated their employees. That's where the big gains are typically made. Certainly in terms of public policy process, Professor Karp just referenced the changes in the National Flood Insurance policy or program. The more risk-based those policies are, the better for everybody. But those have to be phased in gradually because there's some real complications with how those affect people.
With the blue tie. What's it? Oh, I'm sorry. You want to hear it first? I guess I'm moderating.
My name's Peggy Bensinger. I work in the Attorney General's office in Maine, and I advise the Department of Environmental Protection on their coastal sand dune regulations and coastal wetland regulations. And my question's for Professor Karp. Several decades ago, Maine adopted coastal sand dune regulations based essentially on retreat. Since then, due to political forces, the regulations have retreated from that retreat. Do you know of, I mean, retreat sounds great. It's really, really hard to actually make it happen. Do you know of any instances, either in the US or in other countries, where through regulatory mechanisms, retreat has, a country or a state has stuck by a retreat approach?
So I believe it's North Carolina, though it could be South Carolina, but I think it's North Carolina that's chosen an erosion model that basically says that any property that's within a zone that experiences between 30 and 60 times the baseline erosion rate is going to pay a very high premium. And it sends a market message. It at least sends a message to that property owner to take account of whether or not that property is worth salvaging when the foundation is undermined. I guess what I would say is I would point to California and the West Coast as states that have done a very good job of using the public trust doctrine as a way to protect the public's interest below mean high tide and to force private property owners to respect that as a superior legal interest. We're a really strong public trust doctrine state. It's written into our Constitution, which is unlike many states in the US. And so in principle, we can use the public trust doctrine to force people back. So private property owners cannot extend their private interests below mean high tide. And I know that we've got a problem going on about how we draw mean high tide and that it needs to be redrawn. Nevertheless, I think the public trust doctrine is a tool. I also think public nuisance is a powerful tool. I actually don't believe anybody has, it's very easy for the Rhode Island Attorney General, for example, to basically argue nobody has a right to disperse their construction debris all over public beaches. Now, do I know of a state that's done it? I think the West Coast states are the best. Texas has done actually a good job. I think the Severance case is actually a mixed message. I think the Severance case upheld the public trust doctrine. The U.S. Supreme Court has upheld the public trust doctrine 2 times in the past year. In terms of, not in the past year, Stop the Beach Renourishment's an important case for that. But also the Montana People's Power, the Montana Public Utility versus Montana also is a pretty clear articulation of states' public trust interests. And I would say the states can stand on that. I will go one last step, and that is I've already written this recommendation. It's fallen on deaf ears, but that is, I think, the state of Rhode Island could turn to the Attorney General's office and appoint a master to oversee the properties which suffered over 50% damage and simply say no, and somewhat insulate our coastal zone state, our agency, the CRMC, from political pressure to allow rebuilding where rebuilding plainly should not occur. And I think if we have a master handle some of that, we might have better decision-making made.
Might I add? I think actually in Florida there have been instances, and I wouldn't say as a state that it has by any stretch of the imagination resisted this, the forces. If anything, I mean, development interests clearly run the state of Florida. Nonetheless, in a couple of counties there are actually local prohibitions on armoring. And there have been houses that have simply fallen in because they could not be armored. And these are what were previously, $1 million homes, and they ended up in the water.
So I guess that's the difference between retreat and surrender, right, which we do a lot. Porter, could you get a microphone on?
Hi, I'm Porter Hoagland. I'm at the Marine Policy Center at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. And I think my question is for Professor Karp, at least initially. Jim Titus at EPA has been focusing on this question for a long time. And he had this idea, which I think he started promoting at least 3 decades ago, called presumed mobility. And I didn't know whether it might have showed up on your list, on that slide that you had of the typology. But the idea was something like an eminent domain idea where the government would purchase coastal properties, but then lease them back to the owners. And then if they were inundated or the property was destroyed to a certain extent, the owners would have to give it up. And that, according to his calculations, it would be much cheaper that way than purchasing the properties. So my question is, have you seen this implemented anywhere? Is this an idea that's on the table, or is it something that's been abandoned?
As I understand it, Maine has adopted this approach. So it's this basically purchase and lease back idea. And Rhode Island actually is set up to do this, whether or not Rhode Island has actually tried it, because the Coastal Greenway project is basically a negotiation between the state and a coastal property owner to create a vegetative buffer and then to allow shoreline access, so that basically to create a true buffer between the property. But as I understand it, Maine's the state that actually has tried this so far, and I agree with James Titus that that's probably the best way to go, as opposed to rolling easements, for example, is purchase and lease back.
Barry Costa-Pierce, I'm the director of the Marine Science Center at the University of New England. Professor Ginis, every time I hear you speak, you scare the living daylights out of me. This idea that we're going to see Category 4s and 5 hurricanes increase by more than 80%, and the blocking high that was in the Arctic. So are we to expect those, with greater melting, that blocking high to be a more permanent feature? And can we then sort of, again, alarm people even more that this is occurring and that these storms that are the most destructive ones, the 38 hurricane and now the Sandy, are going to be more frequently turned to the left around September and October. Is that even possible for you to project out that scenario into the future?
Well, how many of you know that the last 3 hurricane seasons were one of the most active seasons on the record? Most of you don't. The reason is that most of those storms ended up in the open ocean. We have not had a major hurricane making landfall in the U.S. for the last 7 years. The last one was Hurricane Wilma. So, in a way, we've been lucky that most of those storms ended up in the open ocean. And there is a concern that if there might be some changes in the weather patterns, and those steering winds that are responsible for moving hurricanes around the Atlantic might change. We don't know how, but it is feasible that the patterns of the steering winds might change in such a way that we might get more frequent storms making landfall. Even the total number of storms may stay the same, but the frequency of landfalls potentially can be increased. We don't know that. Now, we mentioned this feature of the blocking related to the melting of the Arctic. That there's one study, only one study, that suggested that might lead to, in the future, a more frequency of this type of weather patterns. It's called the North Atlantic Oscillation, NAO. It's listed as phases of positive and negative phases. And whether the climate change will change the frequency of those phases, we don't know yet. And unfortunately, the climate models at present time cannot explicitly simulate this type of features. They are pretty coarse resolution, spatial resolution. So we not have still ability of downscaling to the scales that would be necessary for us to understand how the tropical cyclone tracks may be modified. But that's certainly something that we need to look into more carefully, and I'm sure that scientists will be continue to looking into this. The good news is that over the last 5 years, there's been significant increase in the computing power that allows the scientists to use the more advanced, the more sophisticated computer models. So we might be able to, at some point, to start looking at the more specific details of the implication of climate change in terms of extreme weather conditions in tropical cyclones and other types.
Okay, we have time for one more question. Yes, please.
I'm Professor Hord from University of Connecticut. I've got an observation on something that Professor Karp said, and then a question to Mr. Ruppert. I walked one of the beaches in Old Lyme, Connecticut, immediately after the recent hurricane, and one of the things that struck me was, well, obviously the damage to maybe 60 houses in a row. That wasn't so surprising, but what was surprising is the size and elegance of many of these houses. And it indicates this moral hazard that you're referring to about transferring some of the risk. It's not necessarily whether a house should be there or not, it's the size of the house. And then the question to Mr. Ruppert is this, that you're saying that there should be more information out there so potential buyers can make a judgment. So what struck me is, where are the banks? Where are the people who are giving out mortgages? Banks use, if they do a mortgage, they use the property as collateral. But if the property is going to be blown away, there is no collateral. So are the banks missing in action here? And are allowing mortgages on these very risky properties? If they're not, then that is a signal directly to property owners right there.
Excellent question. That's a great one. I mean, on the surface, yes, you might think the banks are missing in action and that they're making a huge judgment mistake in their business judgment here. But it's interesting, just maybe a month ago or so, I was checking into a 10-story condominium building that was undermined by Hurricane Dennis in one of the Panhandle counties of Florida. And I wanted to call up the property appraiser, and so we got to talking because I wanted to know how did that impact the county's revenue and property taxes? Here you had this 10-story condo building, and now it's been wiped, it's been undermined, had to be condemned and torn down. So what did that do to your property tax base? How did this storm impact it? And much to my surprise, actually it turns out that most of those properties were all worth more immediately after the storm than they were prior to the storm. And the reason being is this is basically storm-induced gentrification. I mean, as long as we're willing to let people build back and continue to give the subsidies that allow this to happen, then banks are just following the same signals that the property owners are. Nobody's being held responsible for the decisions that we're making.
Yeah, I mean,
I have a fast comment on this, and actually I think Jessica Granis is going to know a lot more about this, but when I prepared this work for Connecticut, it turned out that the banks have actually been delinquent in terms of informing property owners about their responsibility to buy federal flood insurance. And the old NFIP required mortgage lenders to notify their owners that they had to carry insurance. And in Connecticut, it turned out that somewhere between 5 and 20% of property owners had ever heard that message from a bank. So the banks are missing in action, and the federal government can help to deal with that, as can the states.
Yeah. Okay, quickly.
Yeah, just very quick. I'll refer you to an excellent study by the Wharton Risk Center that looked at the take-up of insurance rates and the dropping of those insurance rates and the interaction of the financial sector on these issues.
Yeah.
Some nice work in this.
So I think with your last question, you raised National Flood Insurance Program, local taxes, and one other thing came up there. So I encourage you to go after them during lunch. So how about Joe?
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
We are breaking for lunch. We will be back at 12:30. Preview of coming attractions, view from the federal government, Northeast case studies, and the Arctic. Thank you.
At Crown Dining.